A whole state loses power. Now that's a story. When it happened in South Australia in September 2016, it created chaos. People were stuck in lifts, buildings and in traffic. Factories and companies had to shut down. Families even lost frozen embryos. And it cost the state upwards of $300 million. Journalists, you'd expect, would want to find out what happened and why. Many of them were more interested in defending the zeitgeist that blows for renewable energy. But this power failure was all too predictable because of how the state had long pushed renewables, forcing out most of its baseload generation. 2 months before the blackout, I warned about this vulnerability in Adelaide's Sunday Mail. In that article, I noted that when the wind doesn't blow or the interconnector is broken, we're stuck. The ABC's national political editor, Chris Uhlmann, was prescient, covering a Grattan Institute report and saying it cautioned the rise of intermittent wind generation poses risks in managing the stability and reliability of the power grid. Sure enough, just 3 days after that article, South Australia was plunged into its first statewide blackout. Writing the day after the blackout, Uhlmann highlighted the difficulties presented by the non-synchronous nature of wind energy, raising the proposition the state's disproportionate reliance on it had played a role in the shutdown of the entire state. He was right. Contrary to the insistence of Labor and Greens politicians that the cause of the shutdown was simply fallen transmission lines, subsequent investigations showed the interconnector had been tripped by the shutting down of wind farms in response to voltage drops caused by losing the transmission lines. Uhlmann was simply doing his job. And any journalist should be doing that. He was just reporting the facts. And for that, he was actually vilified. A media lecturer, can you believe, Ben Eltham, went on the attack on Twitter, tweeting that he had complained to the ABC about Uhlmann. The Australian Communications and Media Authority later ruled that Uhlmann did not breach accuracy or impartiality guidelines. Eltham even maintained that the ABC's political editor shouldn't have reported on the blackout but left it to the environment or science reporter. When an entire state loses its power? Seriously. Journalism academic, yep, another one of those. Wendy Bacon backed Eltham, saying that Uhlmann had made a poor contribution on what she called South Australia's extreme weather event. Former 10 political reporter Paul Bongiorno even said the storm was a direct result of climate change. Hobart Mercury columnist and Green Left activist Greg Barnes tweeted that Uhlmann was not a journalist but a propagandist. Former Fairfax columnist Margot Kingston referred to Uhlmann's anti-wind energy rant. And former Financial Review deputy editor and founder of reneweconomy.com.au, Giles Parkinson, said Uhlmann was dead wrong. On the ABC Insiders, only days after the blackout, journalist Laura Tingle gave renewables the all clear.
But I think this goes to the question of the transmission system. It's not about generation, it's about the transmission system, whether it's the towers falling over or how the whole transmission networks works within the state or at a national level.
And Fran Kelly was distressed that the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull had highlighted the state's ambitious renewable energy targets.
In my view, the Prime Minister was very ill-judged to use the form of words he did. He didn't say what I just said, let's harmonise, let's get together. He said it eventually, but first he gave the states a whack around the chops, saying, you know, there are renewable energy targets in South Australia, Victoria and Queensland, all Labor states. He could have mentioned the ACT, overly ambitious, unrealistic.
Now, all of this stuff, and especially the attacks on Uhlmann, ignored the evidence, and it was driven by Green Left ideology, in contrast to Uhlmann's factual, rational analysis. Yet, for his trouble, he copped unhinged personal and professional abuse, often from people claiming to comment as journalists. And now the Australian Energy Regulator is taking court action against the wind farms, alleging they failed to provide automatic protection systems to enable them to ride through voltage disturbances to ensure continuity of supply. Uhlmann's reporting was already vindicated by the facts. The court action underlines the point. But don't expect his critics to acknowledge that. After all, much of the media seems to be so compromised on this issue that to report on the unreliability of renewable energy amounts ridiculously to climate denialism and thus heresy. Chris Uhlmann is now the Nine Network's national political editor. I spoke to him earlier today. Chris Uhlmann, you simply reported the facts about the reliability or unreliability of renewable energy. Now, subsequent events and reports have vindicated everything that you did report. Why was that seen as some act of heresy?
It's hard to say, Chris. I mean, really, at the time, and you might recall, being a South Australian, you would have watched that energy market, and there were some signs from at least the year before that there were problems in the South Australian energy market because there were these massive price spikes. And, of course, we saw the closure of the Northern coal-fired power station, and the grid really was reliant then on the interconnector with Victoria. So there were a whole series of issues that made me think there was something I needed to look at. And then there was a Grattan Institute report, and, in fact, the first report that I did on the problems in South Australia's energy market came 3 days before the lights went out and said that the reliance now, the over-reliance at that stage on renewable energy without anything really to bolster it, had created some significant problems in the energy market in South Australia. It was simply a fact.
Yeah, so why is it, do you think, in this issue that facts create such an emotional and volatile response?
And unfortunately, Chris, we can't separate ideology in the energy wars. Now, there's been a lot of criticism, and I think sometimes rightly, with people on the right and the effect that they've had on the debate here. But I think what's often missed is that those on the left are just as rabid and sometimes more so. And even if you raise any questions at all about the technical problems that come with trying to apply 21st century technologies onto a 20th century grid, it does create some. Even if you raise those, you're seen as being some kind of climate change denier. Well, unfortunately, you can't deny the reality. Those technical problems exist, they still exist, and they're still causing problems.
Yeah, this is what's startling about what went on with you, because you were very overtly staying away from any ideological debates. You were just looking at factual arguments. In fact, you were accepting, of course, there needs to be a decarbonisation, a shift to renewables, but you just looked at the factual, practical problems of implementing that. Yet you came under enormous attack, even from fellow journalists.
Yeah, and the thing that was interesting, I think, Chris, and it was because at that stage I was working for the ABC, and I've never had a bad word to say about the ABC. They were very good to me for 19 long years. But I think some of the people who watch the ABC believe that they are going to see a particular kind of worldview reflected, and they get incensed when they don't believe that worldviews are being reflected, or even worse, that when they see a worldview that they're at odds with being reflected. So I think that was what helped pour fuel on the fire of this. The ABC received 500 formal complaints, and the ABC's complaint system is like some Soviet-era weapon that's used against journalists in that organisation. I still say that it's a terrible thing for the way the organisation is run, because, you know, you send an email to the ABC complaining about a journalist simply arguing, I think he or she is biased, then you start a whole process which can see that journalist having to respond to multiple complaints, and in my case, 500.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting point. As you say, you've left the ABC now. You're with Nine Media. You've never bagged the ABC. But do you think the audience here played a role when you write about or report about these issues on Channel 9 now, or write about it in the Sydney Morning Herald? Do you get a more rational response? Do you think that when you're at the ABC, there's a big cohort of the audience who are expecting their green left ideology to be reflected back to them?
Well, the great news, Chris, is that when I left the ABC, there were many people who celebrated, and it made them happy. So, you know, I'm glad to bring a little bit of joy into some people's lives, however that might come, even if it's at my expense. But I do think that there's a certain problem with a certain section of the ABC's audience that does believe that there's only one way of seeing the world, and don't like it when that's not reflected. And I think that's actually a problem for the ABC. And yes, there is a difference working in a different media organisation, and specifically at Nine, where I think, you know, there isn't that sense of ownership over the ideology of the organisation, which some seem to think that they can exercise over the ABC.
I want to get back to the reaction of journalists, though, because we expect the public are going to come at journalists with all sorts of complaints. You've been around long enough to put up with that, and you're not going to complain about it. But it surprised me that people claiming to be commenting as journalists, were hypercritical of your work, suggesting that you were being ideological, I suppose, or rather than just reporting the facts. I'm thinking of people like Paul Bongiorno, Ben Eltham, I think Margot Kingston got involved in it. These people claim to be journalists.
Yeah, well, Paul's a mate, you know, and Paul and I have had some robust disagreements in the past, and quite frankly, Chris, you and I are like, you know, we've been prepared to dish it out over time. We should be prepared to take it. But one of the things that I found a bit disappointing about some of that was I wasn't engaging in commentary as much as I was trying to engage in a bit of reporting. Now, there was commentary around it, of course, but I think that it was based on absolutely on the facts. And, you know, I went early on saying that there was going to be, it would be found that there was a problem with the wind power there. Now, there'll be argument over, it was just a certain group of wind farms that didn't have their technical settings correct. Well, since then, there's been an enormous amount of work done in South Australia on the problem of integrating renewables, and the problems appear to simply grow with time. So, you know, it is an issue that has to be addressed. And yes, I find the sort of commentary of some journalists a little bit puzzling, because I think, let's just deal with the issue. We might well have a fight over how this progresses in the future. But, you know, it's not going to help the renewable energy industry to have an unreliable source of power on the grid. I would have thought over time that actually is going to help to damage their argument.
Chris, congratulations on that reporting. Thanks for joining us and sharing your insight.
Thanks, mate.